I would recommend, at least every 2 weeks, if not weekly, if, it's been dry on your farm and then the rain starts again, you're creating that perfect environment for these parasites. So it's just something to be considering, especially with finishing lambs or with replacement ewes and stuff, to be just aware of the impact that these parasitic infections will have on the likes of, I suppose, the performance of these animals and the welfare of these animals.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Chocolate Sheep podcast. Each episode bringing less insights, advice and technical updates to the sheep industry. In this episode I'm joined by Amanda McEvoy to discuss the impact of recent weather conditions on warm burdens in sheep flocks. Amanda explains to us how lambs become infected and how weather influences the development and survival of parasites on pasture. We discuss the recent dry spell, how it has affected warm burdens and why changing weather conditions, particularly the increase in moisture, can quickly change the risk on farms. Amanda also highlights the importance of monitoring warm burdens closely at this stage of the season, especially following the summer's weather patterns. Maybe just to start us off, and it's probably something I haven't actually done in the previous episodes, could you maybe explain to me a little bit about how lambs actually pick up the burden and what happens until we actually see a worm count?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're thinking of kind of picking up infection on grass, it's important to understand the life cycle of the parasites. So with the stomach worms, what happens is your infected sheep, whether they're ewes or lambs, will shed eggs in their feces. So these eggs will then hatch on grass and become the non-infective L1 and L2 larvae stage. So these are all microscopic worms. We can't see them, but they're living there in the feces.
Right, so they're in the development stage, L1, L2 stage, they're in the feces on the pasture. What happens to them then, Amanda?
So from there, they develop into the infective stage, and the infective stage is where the worm, so the parasitic worm, will migrate up and down the blades of grass in the hopes that it'll be ingested by the sheep to continue on its life cycle. So with lambs in particular, you can imagine they're ingesting these infective stage larvae. Their immune system is quite naive. They haven't yet developed immunity against these parasitic worms. So they're more likely to develop clinical symptoms, to develop disease, and also for the parasites to survive and continue their life cycle of shedding eggs in the feces. So it's important to be aware of how the life cycle works on grass. With ewes, it's slightly different. They have immunity, they've been exposed, so they can fight off these infective stages, or the adult stages within, so they don't persist as long within the, I suppose, the mature ewes. So with lambs, it's important to recognise the impacts that these parasitic worms can have within them from picking them up on grass.
There's a lot there to understand, so there is, but
Yeah.
it's a good explainer of what actually happens. Amanda, if we think about that, there's several implications from grazing management to effective climate. I suppose we should preface this by saying it's mainly the strong guide worms we're focusing on here, particularly I suppose your
Yeah.
Telling stage and Trichostrongus, but they're the ones we're really seeing the big impact of on the majority of farms out there for the summer. What impact then? So they're on the blades of grass. Obviously, we've different contaminated levels of contamination on pasture on farms. So more
Yeah.
heavily grey sheep, more regularly grey sheep pasture will have more burden on them. How long do they survive on that pasture?
It's, to be honest, Kieran, it's kind of a tricky one. There's no real answer. So it really is dependent on the environment, so the amount of moisture available, and also the temperatures. So these infective stage larvae, they don't actually eat anything. So this, I suppose they survive off their own energy reserves. So what has kind of been shown in the past is that with high temperatures, they are more mobile, so they burn out more energy reserves and will eventually die off. So potentially that's what may happen over the last couple of weeks with the high temperatures. But also they're resilient, they'll survive. So if they don't have the moisture to be traveling up and down, they won't be burning as much energy. So it's kind of it's a confusing one with regards to how long they can survive on pasture.
Okay. Amanda, I suppose if we looked at the conditions we've had this summer, we've had particularly dry periods there. I know that's not affected all of the country, it's starting to creep up on it, but that's going to have an impact on warm burdens. So particularly maybe for them real dry areas that experience those hot temperatures, those drought-like conditions, what happens warm counts on those farms? Like we typically can see prolonged periods there where we don't, for those that are monitoring, we don't see warm counts increasing much. Why is that?
So you can imagine these infective stage larvae, they need moisture in order to migrate up the blades of grass. And if we don't have the rain, They can't do that. So we don't see as much, I suppose, larval contamination on the pasture at the moment. But what's important to remember is that the infected lambs, the infected ewes, are still passing these eggs and the feces that are still continuing on their life cycle within the feces. So while we might not see egg counts at the moment, what we will see is that when the rainfall continues or begins again, is that the feces can be rehydrated and the life cycle will continue. So we can see a surge in egg counts, ironically, from absolutely low levels of, a couple of eggs to in the thousands quite quickly over the space of, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, really. So it's important to be doing your fecal egg counts like quite regularly this time of year, given the weather profile.
And that's important because there's probably two real important elements in that. One is when you have that prolonged dry spell, the burden is not there on the pasture for the lambs to pick up, so it's not. And the need for dose is severely reduced. So good idea to
Yeah.
monitor from that point of view. But it also shows how quick the thing can change once you do get that bit of moisture.
Absolutely. And I think the important thing to remember is that the parasites, they're in the feces. So, quite often you'll see animals, they'll be in the shade, congregating around water troughs and stuff. So where you see a lot of fecal matter, there'll be a high burden of these parasites within the feces. So once that rainfall comes again, those areas will be very, very highly contaminated. So you can go from 0 to 90 very quickly in these areas because of that.
It also goes to maybe highlight the fact that, look, we do have variation on farms. We have different levels of boarding and pasture. There is clean or pasture, not necessarily clean, but clean or being after grass and otherwise.
Mhm.
A lot of factors to consider there, but given the change we've seen in conditions on parts of the country, obviously it hasn't reached everywhere yet, rain, but it's something that could change very quickly. And that rapid rise, particularly after a period maybe of low exposure, can cause
Mhm.
challenges in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll see a lot of lambs will go backwards. They'll start losing weight. They'll start developing kind of clinical disease. And there's a lot of things to be mindful of this time of year with such a surge in parasite burden, really. So, obviously doing your fecal egg counts is brilliant, but because you might not detect by fecal egg count for the first, say, 2 weeks, it's good to be looking at the animals as well, making sure that they are thriving, they are eating grass, they are,
Performing.
looking
Yeah.
well.
You're touching something there, like from a lamb ingesting that parasite to you actually getting it in that egg count. What's the time lag on that?
So it depends on the species of parasite, but you're talking anywhere from kind of 2 to 3 weeks for it to kind of reach the sexually mature adult egg laying stage within the host. But you can imagine this is not from day 1 to day 14. It's trickle infections. They're continuously picking them up as they're grazing on ground. So, you might not see necessarily a high egg count today, but next week you might see one, or the week after it could increase exponentially. So that's where it's really important to be looking for these things and monitoring for these infections.
You touched on that last bit. That's important. Like, we consider in the context one of the big challenges we have on antimicrobial resistance, impact that can have on performance.
Mhm.
Monitoring boarding at this stage of the season is a very useful thing to do.
Absolutely. And to be honest, it's brilliant how accessible fecal egg counts are now to farmers, whether it's veterinary practices or commercial labs. So I would strongly advocate for the fecal egg counts because you might not necessarily need to dose this time, but in 2 or 3 weeks' time, you could definitely need to dose. And kind of like what you said there, Kieran, it's really important for anthelmintic resistance to be dosing when it's needed, but also to be checking that the dose is working. So to do the follow-up treatment or the follow-up fecal egg count as well to make sure that there was a reduction in the egg burden.
Well, look, I think that was useful, but particularly important for those that are after experiencing that dry spell. Just be vigilant of what can happen and
Yeah.
hopefully a bit better understanding of how that thing can change so quick.
Absolutely. Like it's unpredictable, but at the same time, this time of year we do see the egg counts rise anyways, this kind of period of summer. So I would recommend, at least every 2 weeks, if not weekly, if it's been dry on your farm and then the rain starts again, you're creating that perfect environment for these parasites. So it's just something to be considering, especially with finishing lambs or with replacement ewes and stuff, to be just aware of the impact that these parasitic infections will have on the likes of, I suppose, the performance of these animals and the welfare of these animals.
Amanda, look, good having you back on us. Thanks for that update, and it's certainly something to be vigilant for at the moment.
Thank you very much, Kieran.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Amanda for coming back on us. An important thing to consider on farms at the moment. That's it for me. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.